the President of the United States of America, Barack Hussein Obama, shortly before his visit to Ghana, compared the development of his dad's native country, Kenya, to the relative development of South Korea and Malaysia. Now, I don't think that comparison is fair because those countries aren't even good enough for the comparison that ought to be made. We are going to compare the development of a typical African country like Cameroon to that of the United States of America. So let's look at Cameroon. Cameroon is just about 50 years old. So we ought to compare it with the development of the United States of America 50 years post-independence. When you think about the development of and we have completely different challenges that Cameroon has, which we have studied. We've seen a lot of them in the history and the damages done by colonization. Now, when you look at United States of America, when it was just 50 years old, it was the famous Wild Wild West. There was guns on the street, there was robbery, rape, corruption. In fact, you don't, like 80 years, when it was 80 years old, you had the successions, you had the South, trying to succeed from the North, you had all those wars. You don't even have to go back to when it was 50 years post-independence. We can compare Cameroon with America 250 years ago. 250 years ago, during the famous time you had this New York gangster that Denzel Washington acted a movie about, Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas was a drug bandit. And at that time, this was when America was a whole 250 years old. At that time, half of the NYPD, because you always talk about corruption in Africa, and we say, why they're so corrupt? Why is there so much corruption in their law enforcement? Half of the New York State Police Department, the NYPD, was sacked. Now, these are the half that had enough charges to be indicted. Probably more than 90% of the New York Police Department at age 250 were corrupt. Half of them were sacked for engaging with Frank Lucas in selling drugs around New York. This is when America was 250 years old. Now, when you look at America today, what is America credited with? The United States of America in 2009 is credited with the murder of at least 1 million people worldwide right now and more per year. Now, I'm not talking about from global warming and their refusal to sign the Kyoto Conference. I'm talking about the recession, the global recession, the economic recession of the United States, and the impact on the world, the damage done by this recession to capital of the entire world due to corruption in the United States banking sector at age 300, and corruption from government bodies monitoring the United States banking sector due to direct corruption has caused damage to the world economy that has led to the death of at least 1 million people per annum. This is United States of America at age 300. Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, said that the democratic process in America is still evolving. We are talking of democracy still evolving over 2,000 years. Maybe it's time to get rid of multi-party democracy. She said it's still evolving because there's still corruption in the ranks. You understand? So the development of we are comparing the development of Cameroon with the United States of America, and we are seeing that the scale of corruption is much higher, and the development of America is not so much something to be envied. Now, when you now compare that with Cameroon and typical African nations and what they've been faced with, we've seen a lot of the damage that happened to them due to colonization. We've recognized the fact that the Western powers handed over to stooges, to the most retarded people. That's why I call nations of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, made in, like Nigeria, made in the UK. When you look at a country like Cameroon, Cameroon was first colonized by the French, by the Germans, and during one harsh regime with harsh rules. Later on, some sectors were taken over by French, and you think of people who are learning German and then they're learning French, and then later the British colonized the North, and then the Muslim North voted to join, after independence in 1960, voted to join Nigeria. So you have all these, and then the Western powers handed over to stooges, to foolish leaders, foolish people, orchestrated the first election malpractice in these countries, and then forced these leaders to take IMF, World Bank loans, of which these countries have paid back double to the West. Now, we are beginning to see the serious challenges that African nations have as compared to United States of America. Now, after these foolish stooges, like, think of Afghanistan today. The new Afghanistan is 8 years old. A stooge, United States of America handed over to a stooge who is already having corruption malpractices, and Afghanistan today is a typical way we should understand the problem Africa faces. Afghanistan today is worse than it was before United States colonized it. It's exporting much more opium. There is much more crimes against humanity in Afghanistan today with the stooge leader. And this is the same thing. The stooge leaders that the Western powers handed over to in Africa took these loans and then accepted SAP policies to restrict Africa and Africa education. There were no more subsidies on education, no more subsidies on agriculture. They had to produce only goods that are exportable. All this damage to the African system. And after that, like you think about the amount of money that the African nations pay to the Western world, which is more than they get. As the French president Francois Mitterrand admitted in 1994 that the North, the Western countries, take much more from African countries than African countries get. Then when you think about SAP and what it did, and then you think about unfair trade, the fact that African countries are in a type of perpetual continental slave labor as prices are pinned ridiculously to the Western world's advantage. Then you think about the gun trade, where the United States single-handedly in the last United Nations meeting vetoed against banning small arms, which are responsible for 99% of deaths and ethnic wars in Africa. United States of America sells $15 billion worth of small arms to Africa, which causes into the hands of all these miscreants and militants, which causes wars in Africa. When you think of all these things that are thrown against African nations and you compare to United States of America that does not have such world powers hinging and limiting and forcing them into this kind of destructive development, then we always hear about the Western world giving aid to Africa. In a very, very beautiful article written by a guy, he's a lawyer in New York, Paul Adugie, it's the truth about foreign aid, where it really goes and not Africa. You now find out that only 1% of foreign aid goes to Africa. When it appears the Western world is giving aid, they take these beautiful pictures with some African stooge leader, because we are still in the generation of stooge leaders who they handed over power to. When this generation dies out, probably the younger generation in Africa, who have not been brainwashed and destroyed by colonization, will be able to help Africa progress. But the problem that now happens is when you have leaders like Thomas Sankara who bring about progress. He renamed his country. We'll talk about the process of progress in the next section. But when you have these kind of leaders, the West orchestrates their death to stop them being able to get Africa out of the web, the mingled web it is in. Now, when you have, these pictures of this foreign aid being given to Africa, only 1% goes to Africa. Most foreign aid goes to countries like Israel that benefit from this aid. Only 1% of the aid goes to Africa. So really, comparing Africa to South Korea or Malaysia is insulting, because the development of Africa, with what it faces, with the way it has been divided into regions that are totally incompatible and forced to exist in these regions. Now, the solution to this division into regions and how to get Africa out of this mess, we'll discuss in the next part. But when you look at what has been thrown at Africa, when you look at the whole damage, when you look at how Africa is still being exploited, when you look at diamond trade, when you look at all these things, you come to recognize that the progress Africa has made, a typical country like Cameroon has made in 50 years, is commendable and compares is greater than the progress America has made with the trials and tribulations that it has. I was in Ghana recently, and on the radio they said they described America typically like this, and it's like, that Ghanaians totally understand this about America. In a casual statement, the guy says, United States of America was built on stolen land and with stolen resource, because the human resource that has been tapped, that was stolen from Africa in the slave deportation, we are talking about 30 to 300 million people. This human resource are the people who built the Western economies. Economists have studied this and realized that the building of the Western economies that are praised today is from human resource from Africa. It's Africans who built United States in slave labor. So when you think of Africans losing their best people and losing that amount of human resource and the natural resource, and then this natural resource was now used to build the Western nations, and this human resource was used to build the Western nations. I mean, it's just, this video is about people, so people can understand the problems and now can deal with them the right way. Anyway, we'll move ahead and we'll discuss possible solutions, because just talking about what went wrong and what is wrong is not good enough.